Hi, welcome back to Innovators. This is number 10. Mark Weidenbaum writes, "Anonymity takes many forms. Silence is one, confusion another." From the early 1990s and onwards, there is one electronic artist that continues to confound music critics and his fans alike. His approach to music composition has been described as like an electronic symphony, multi-layered with several coincident harmonic levels. It revelled both in melodic and timbral invention. A pioneer, he's also been defined as perhaps the most unpredictable and spiky of modern digital artists. He's reputed to have composed thousands of pieces of music, many of which have been released via the internet. This is separate from the dozens of official releases that have been issued under several aliases. Odd stories arose in the few interviews that he would grant, such as composing while asleep, living in a bank vault, owning a tank, or DJing with sheets of sandpaper. Musicians and composers are always looking for their own sound when they compose, and what I mean is some form of individuality, something that makes them stand out, something that makes them unique. It would be fair to say that Innovator number 10 most certainly achieved that within his first releases, and his influence on electronic music composition, structure and sound has forged new musical territories that many have followed and explore today within their own music writing. For the fan, during the early years, it was hard to keep account of Innovator number 10's releases due to the number of aliases he was recording under. However, there was something unmistakable about the kinds of sounds that linked these records together, despite their initial apparent disparateness from tempos to textures. However, noting the record labels and the slow leaking of information through the music press, one could join all the dots. As his profile grew, so did the opportunity to produce videos to accompany the singles, and these were as uncompromising as the tunes they were set to. His music began to appear in television and film, propelling his star forward. However, he's always claimed just to be making music for himself. Still twisting sounds into new forms, I present Innovator number 10, Richard James, most commonly known as Aphex Twin. Born in 1971, Richard James was born in Limerick, Ireland, but soon his family relocated to a remote village in Cornwall, where he would grow up. In his teens, Richard James began experimenting with tape recorders and slowly began incorporating circuits and synthesizers to the mix. He would dismantle some of these pieces of equipment to, in the words of Mark Prendergast in the book Ambient Century, make something new out of them. As James said himself, "I've always been into banging things and making weird noises." Self-taught, his homemade circuits and hacked hardware led him to study electronics at Kingston University. After hearing the Chicago house classic Mr. Fingers by Larry Heard, his music began to explore the textures of acid house. He started DJing locally in Cornwall, incorporating his own music into his sets. Friends began circulating tapes of his compositions amongst themselves, leading to interest in releasing a record on local label Mighty Force in 1991. That record, entitled Analog Bubble Bath Volume 1, was described in The Rough Guide to Techno as lyrical, fluid, liquid and rhythmic. It was a striking record and earned an early cult following. Simon Reynolds, in his book Energy Flash, has stated that, with its fluttery, diaphanous riff pattern and hazy yet crystalline production, Bubble Bath announced a new soft-core direction in techno, meditational, melodically intricate and ambient-tinged. Collaborating with Tom Middleton, who would go on to his own success under the name Global Communication, amongst others, the EP was released under the name Aphex Twin. However, all forthcoming Aphex Twin releases would be solo affairs. In the same year, Richard James and his friend Grant Wilson Claridge formed Reflex Records and released another EP of material from James under the name Bradley Strider on the Bradley Beats EP. The Didgeridoo EP, released in 1992 by R&S Records, cemented his reputation and, in the words of Simon Reynolds, impacted the hardcore dance floor in a big way. He also explains that analog bubble bath and didgeridoo mark out the poles of the Aphex sound spectrum. Synth-siphoned balm for the soul versus clangorously percussive noise. Several other releases followed in the same year under the aliases Caustic Window, The Dice Man and Pac-Man. It was at this point that his association with Warp Records began with his contributions to the Artificial Intelligence compilations. R&S also released his first long player, Selected Ambient Works 85 to 92, reputed to be a collection of tracks recorded between those years, suggesting that Richard James had potentially been ahead of the curve with regards to ambient and hardcore techno music of the time. As claimed in the Rough Guide to Techno, it's one of those albums that has spawned thousands of imitators. As Mark Prendergast states, by the end of 1992, James was a techno star. 1993 brought another album under another guise, this time Polygon Window, and the album Surfing on Sine Waves. Moving into North London, Richard James built a new studio consisting of old EMS, Moog and ARP synths that were reconfigured to his own specifications, whilst making his own customised effects such as phasers, flanges, spring reverbs and filters. The Aphex Twin On EP reached number 32 in the UK Top 40 of that year as well, bringing him to an even wider audience. At this point, when interviewed, James would allude to hundreds of unreleased tracks that he had composed, but whether they would see the light of day would be another matter. Selected Ambient Works Volume 2, released on Warp in 1994, gained mixed reviews. Loved by the fans, it was criticised by some in the music press for being too self-indulgent. Potentially with his previous releases presenting new templates for sound, critics were expecting more and also something more new sounding. James's approach to writing this album was through lucid dreaming. When interviewed by Mark Prendergast, he said, "This was me basically going asleep, dreaming up a track in my studio or in an imaginary studio with imaginary equipment, and then waking myself up and recreating that track in my studio." Some critics loved it and began suggesting that James was a genius. He was only 22 at the time and a prolific and original recording artist, so it's understandable how those claims were being made. His subsequent albums, I Care Because You Do in 1995 and Richard D. James in 1996, were more beat-driven, featuring more hip-hop and breakbeat-derived rhythms, with the latter containing bastardized forms of drum and bass, soon to be known as drill and bass and glitch. Taking the time-stretching techniques of drum and bass and marrying it to glitch-like structures that appear to fall in and out of time, taking beats and, in the words of Rob Young in the book Undercurrents, accelerating or decelerating them, squashing or compacting them, these ripped, zipped beats provided a tentative bridgehead between the glitch and street musics like jungle and drum and bass. In the early 1990s, artists like Aphex Twin and Orteka were exploring rhythmical structures that would lead to the development of the music genre glitch. As described in Kim Cascone's article in Computer Music Journal in 2000, the glitch genre arrived on the back of the electronica movement, an umbrella term for alternative, largely dance-based electronic music, including house, techno, electro, drum and bass and ambient, that has come into vogue in the past 5 years. As the AllMusic website describes, as computer-aided composition slowly eclipsed the traditional analog approach to crafting electronica, the palette of possible sounds soon widened immensely, resulting in the advent of the glitch style in the late 1990s. No longer was the artist confined to sequenced percussion, synth and samples, but rather any imaginable sound, including the uncanny realm of digital glitches. It should be noted that James's expertise with computer programming, writing his own code and understanding circuit manipulation allowed him to program his own algorithms to devastating effect, creating elements in his music that seemed to shift through time through the use of complex cross and compound rhythms. This was several years before software companies caught on and started developing plugins that would allow the user to recreate these processes. One key aesthetic to the glitch sound is the bouncing ball effect. A sound is triggered and then re-triggers increasingly quickly as the loop's length is reduced, creating a pitch tone when the loop gets very short, eventually reaching extremely high frequencies. This results in the sound appearing to be stretching through time, both in speed and pitch. Like a bouncing ball does when dropped, the ball's height reduces on each bounce, and each bounce is faster than the last as the ball's height decreases. Essentially, to calculate this, you need the equation for standard constant acceleration, which is s equals ut plus at squared divided by 2. S is distance, u is the initial speed, in this case 0, t is time, and a is acceleration, for example 32 feet per second squared. And if the height is half the first time, it will be 1/4 the second time, 1/8 the third time, and so on. You can hear this process being used to great effect in Aphex Twin's Yellow Calx and, appropriately, Bucephalus Bouncing Ball, named after the effect it presents throughout the track. As Rob Young describes, it speeds up a pulse as if it were an object bouncing on a table subject to the force of gravity. Interviewed in Keyboard magazine in 1997, James said, "I've been using my own program to create new algorithms. The algorithm I just finished is a percussion thing that lets you swap and change the sounds. It does bass as well, but it's really acidy. You can leave it on for an hour and it really comes up with some mad shit. I made it learn to gradually change the music over time." Although James's Aphex Twin output seemed to slow down after the release of Richard D. James, he was still able to challenge and shock fans and critics alike with videos for the singles Come to Daddy, Window Licker and Rubber Johnny, directed by Chris Cunningham, who devised equally strange, bizarre and, on occasion, deeply disturbing visuals to accompany and match the musical aesthetics of each track. Another Aphex Twin double album would appear in the form of Drux in 2001. Whilst releases such as the 12-inch only Analord series under the name AFX would show James's slight return to acid-tinged techno in 2005, alongside more analog syncopated synth and drum-based tracks under the name The Tuss and Caustic Window. The Aphex Twin moniker would return briefly as one of the Analord releases in 2005, but properly in September 2014 for the release of Cyro. However, in May 2015, user 48736353001 appeared on SoundCloud and dumped in excess of 200 tracks for free download, each significantly in the style of Richard James, although he denied it at the time. The SoundCloud page stated, "I am not Richard," before it was shut down permanently by the creator a few weeks later. It was apparent that he'd been amassing tracks over the years, as he had stated back in the 90s, and decided to put them out. Richard James deserves the plaudit of innovator because he continues to challenge and inspire in equal measure. His music has not settled into one specific form, although when heard there are distinct elements that are aesthetics or signifiers of his work. He does not appear to care whether his music has an audience, but is rather more interested in the mechanics of creating sounds for himself. Selling his music is more of a byproduct. As he said himself in an interview with Philip Sherborne for Pitchfork magazine in 2014, "It's more interesting for me to stick things out anonymously. You get more of an honest reaction to what you've done. There's no expectation in what people say, but that changes from culture to culture." From rewiring synthesizers and building circuits in his teens, to developing his own software languages in the 1990s, through to use of electromechanical devices such as drum robots, MIDI pipe organs, Disclavier-controlled pianos and computer-controlled percussion in the 2000s, James has not sat still when exploring for new textures and ways to compose. His influence stretches across many electronic music genres and styles. As argued by Tony Morris in the book Modulations, critics compared Aphex to Mozart, Stockhausen, My Bloody Valentine, Velvet Underground, Eno and Holst. Many resent him and find him churlish. They wonder about the balance between talent, hype, and immaturity in his work. But he's still there, still fanaticised, still popular, and still rising. Supporting this argument, in the words of Ben Neal in Audio Culture, artists like Aphex Twin paved the way and proved that it is possible for rhythmic electronic music composers to work with the most abstract sound processes, experimental textures and techniques, as well as rhythmic materials that make reference to, but do not fit within, specific pre-existing dance music genres. Therefore, Richard James is innovator number 10. Thanks for watching. See you next time.